In the year 2400 before Christ, in the shadow of the great ziggurat of Uruk, a young woman named Enheduanna walked barefoot across polished stone floors toward a chamber where no historian would dare to follow. She wore nothing but linen wrapped around her hips. Copper rings marked her as holy. She was a priestess. She was a virgin dedicated to the goddess Inanna. And within an hour, she would lie with a stranger. The temple called it sacred. The future would call it prostitution. But the truth carved into clay tablets buried for 4,000 years reveals something far more disturbing. It reveals a civilization that built its wealth, its power, and its very concept of divinity on the bodies of women who had no choice but to serve. Women who were told they were blessed. Women who discovered they were merchandise. And the price was recorded in silver, transaction by transaction, night after night, for 2,000 years. This is the story the ancient world tried to bury. The story archaeologists are still afraid to tell completely. The story of how humanity's first civilization turned theology into economics and women into currency. Sumer, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates carved through Mesopotamia like veins of life, feeding the first cities humanity ever raised. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, names that echo from the dawn of written history. Here, before Egypt built its pyramids, before Greece dreamed of democracy, before Rome conquered the known world, the Sumerians invented everything that defines civilization: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, architecture, poetry, and sacred prostitution. The ziggurat of Uruk rose 100 feet above the mud brick city, a mountain built by human hands to bridge earth and heaven. At its summit stood the temple of Inanna, goddess of love, war, fertility, and death. The temple complex covered 12 acres. Within those walls, priestesses lived in luxury unknown to common women. They owned property. They conducted business. They wrote poetry that survives to this day, carved in cuneiform on clay tablets that spent 4 millennia buried in sand. And they sold their bodies in the name of the divine. But here's what the archaeology reveals that most documentaries won't tell you. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after Sumer's peak, described Babylon's temples with horror barely concealed. Every woman in the city, he claimed, was required once in her lifetime to sit in the temple precinct and offer herself to any stranger who threw a coin in her lap. Only after this sacred duty could she return home, her honor intact, her religious obligation fulfilled. Modern scholars dismissed Herodotus as a liar, a gossip, a man repeating exotic rumors to titillate Greek audiences. They called his accounts Orientalist fantasy, cultural prejudice, impossible exaggeration. Then archaeologists began digging in the desert of southern Iraq, and the cuneiform tablets began to speak. Transaction after transaction, payment after payment, names, dates, amounts. The records were meticulous. The temples kept better financial accounts than most modern businesses. But the numbers revealed something the priests never intended anyone to calculate. The temple economy of ancient Sumer was not separate from religion. It was religion made flesh, made transaction, made architecture. Every aspect of survival, agriculture, trade, warfare, fertility, rainfall, harvest, birth, death, depended on appeasing the gods. And the gods, according to Sumerian theology, had appetites. Inanna, queen of heaven, was no gentle mother goddess cradling infants and blessing harvests with serene smiles. Her myths describe her as violent, sexual, capricious, vengeful. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, she propositions the hero king with raw desire. When he rejects her, listing the tragic fates of her previous lovers, she unleashes the bull of heaven to destroy his city. Hundreds die. She feels no remorse. She wanted what she wanted. In another myth, she descends to the underworld, strips naked at 7 gates, and returns with the power to condemn her own husband, Dumuzi, to death, simply because he didn't mourn her absence adequately. She is desire personified, rage personified, power without constraint. Her priestesses reflected her nature. The highest ranking was called the Entu, a woman chosen from noble or royal families, often the daughter of a king. She lived in the Nippur, a sacred residence within the temple complex, built with imported cedar and decorated with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. She was considered the earthly bride of the god. She never married a mortal man. She bore no children. Her virginity was theological. She belonged only to the divine, and the divine did not share. But beneath the Entu existed an entire hierarchy of female temple servants. The Naditu were cloistered women who managed the temple's vast agricultural estates, overseeing thousands of acres of barley fields and date palm groves. The Kadishtu were consecrated women who performed rituals involving music, dance, incense burning, and physical offerings. And the Harimtu, the word itself means both consecrated woman and prostitute in ancient Sumerian. The language made no distinction. Clay tablets from the city of dated to 1200 BCE, record transactions in precise cuneiform script pressed into wet clay with reed styluses. A merchant pays 3 shekels of silver to the temple. In exchange, he is granted access to a priestess for 1 night. The silver goes directly into the temple treasury. The priestess receives a portion, approximately 20%, enough to buy barley, oil, cloth, cosmetics, enough to survive, not enough to leave. Another tablet from the reign of Hammurabi in 1750 BCE lists regulations with brutal clarity. If a Naditu or a Harimtu, who is not residing in a cloister, opens a tavern or enters a tavern for drink, they shall burn that woman. Burn, not fine, not exile. Burn. The law protected the temple's monopoly. Sacred prostitution was not freelance work. It was institutionalized, controlled, taxed, regulated with the same precision as grain storage and silver lending. The temples of Inanna, Ishtar, and Astarte across Mesopotamia operated as combination religious centers, banks, granaries, and brothels. Pilgrims came to worship, merchants came to trade and deposit wealth, and men came to experience communion with the goddess through the flesh of her servants. But what the temple records don't explain is why women stayed when they could have run. The city of Uruk alone had over 300 priestesses registered in temple records from the reign of King Shulgi in 2094 BCE. The annual revenue from sacred offerings, a bureaucratic euphemism that included payments for sexual rites, exceeded 12,000 shekels of silver. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman earned approximately 10 shekels per year. The temple prostitution industry generated income equivalent to 1,200 workers' annual wages. That's not religion. That's an economic sector. The temples controlled approximately 30% of Sumer's arable land. They employed thousands. They operated the ancient world's first banks, lending grain and silver at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. 33% annually was standard. They held monopolies on beer production, textile manufacturing, and long-distance trade. And a significant portion of this vast economic machinery was lubricated by the bodies of women who had been told they were serving the goddess. But the question that haunts every clay tablet, every temple inscription, every archaeological layer: what did the women themselves believe? a clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Nippur in 1893, currently housed in the British Museum under acquisition number UM 29-16-430, tells the story of a woman named Kubatum. The tablet is small, fitting in the palm of a hand, the cuneiform script still sharp after 4,000 years. It's an administrative document, a contract, a record of dedication. Kubatum was born into a family of scribes in the city of Nippur around 2150 BCE. Educated, literate, rare for any woman in the ancient world. At age 14, her father dedicated her to the temple of Inanna, not as punishment, as honor. The ceremony was conducted with incense, prayer, ritual purification, in water mixed with cedar oil imported from Lebanon. She was given a new name, beloved of the goddess, and moved into the temple complex with 29 other young women. The first year she studied. She learned hymns in the sacred language. She memorized the choreography of ritual dances. She practiced the gestures of offering, how to hold the libation bowl, how to burn incense so the smoke rose straight to heaven, how to slaughter a lamb cleanly for sacrifice. She lived in chambers decorated with blue-glazed tiles and furniture inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli. She ate food finer than anything her scribe family could afford, wheat bread, not barley, meat weekly, not monthly, dates, figs, honey. She was told she was blessed by the goddess, that she had been chosen for the highest calling, that her service would ensure prosperity for her city, her family, her people. Then came the night she was called to the chamber of sacred marriage. The tablet does not record her feelings. Sumerian writing favored contracts, inventories, legal codes, astronomical observations, not confessions, not poetry, not the interior lives of women who were inventory themselves. But it records the transaction with bureaucratic precision that somehow makes it more horrifying. A merchant from the city of Kish, traveling to Nippur for trade in copper ingots and textiles, paid the temple 5 shekels of silver. The priestess Kubatum, age 15, was assigned to perform the rite of sacred marriage on behalf of the goddess Inanna. The ritual followed precise steps codified in temple manuals. She bathed in water mixed with cedar oil and crushed flowers. She anointed her body with perfume distilled in the temple workshops, myrrh, frankincense, cassia. She wore a headdress of gold leaves shaped like the sacred rosette of Inanna, each petal hammered so thin it trembled with her breath. She painted her eyes with kohl made from crushed galena. She hennaed her palms and the soles of her feet. She entered the chamber where the merchant waited. There, on a bed draped with crimson wool imported from Anatolia, cushioned with linen from Egypt, she embodied the goddess. The Sumerians believed that in this act, heaven and earth united. The merchant was symbolically Dumuzi, the shepherd god and lover of Inanna. The priestess was Inanna herself, descending from the stars to grant fertility, prosperity, divine favor to the city, the harvest, the herds. The sexual act was not sin. It was prayer made physical. It was cosmic necessity. Without it, the theological text claimed, the rains would fail, the crops would wither, the cattle would sicken, the balance between divine and mortal realms would collapse, and chaos would devour civilization. This is what the priests taught. This is what the hymns declared. This is what the inscriptions proclaimed on every temple wall in cuneiform script that took decades to learn to read. But the tablet also records that Kubatum performed this rite 43 times in a single year. 43 different men. 43 transactions entered into the temple ledger, with the same bureaucratic neutrality as barley shipments and copper receipts. 43 nights, when she embodied the goddess for strangers who paid the temple in silver and left before dawn without speaking her real name. Once per week, sometimes twice, for an entire year. The mathematics are simple. 43 encounters at 5 shekels per encounter equals 215 shekels revenue. Kubatum received approximately 20%, 43 shekels. Enough to live comfortably by ancient standards. Enough to never worry about hunger or homelessness, the twin terrors that haunted 90% of the ancient world's population. But at what cost? The tablet doesn't say. Administrative documents rarely concern themselves with the interior lives of their subjects, though sometimes, in the cracks of bureaucracy, humanity leaks through. A fragment of a personal letter, not an official temple document, was discovered in the residential quarter of in 1922 by archaeologist Leonard Woolley. The letter is incomplete. Fire damaged part of it. Time eroded more. But what remains is preserved in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The cuneiform is shaky, unpracticed, as if written by someone who learned to write but rarely had occasion to use the skill. The translation reads, "Mother, I cannot bear this any longer. They call it sacred, but my body is not my own. The goddess does not speak to me in the night. I feel only." The tablet breaks off. The rest is lost. Whether the letter was ever sent, whether the mother ever received it, whether the young priestess found escape, or endured until death, none of this is recorded. But the letter exists. Someone wrote it. Someone felt the need to confess the unbearable weight of divinity when no one was listening. The temples justified the system through elaborate theology that took centuries to develop and refine. In the Sumerian worldview, humans existed solely to serve the gods. This was not metaphor. This was literal cosmology written into their creation myths. The gods created humans from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain deity, specifically to perform labor the gods found tedious: farming, building, manufacturing, worship. The gods were not distant, abstract entities dwelling in unreachable heavens. They were present, local, hungry, demanding. They lived in the temples, or rather, their statues did, which amounted to the same thing in Sumerian theology. The statues were fed daily, dressed, bathed, put to bed at night, awakened in the morning. They required food placed on altars, bread, beer, meat, fruit. They required libations poured into offering bowls. They required music, incense, sacrifices of animals whose blood was drained into sacred vessels, and they required sexual offerings. The sacred marriage ritual, called hierosgamos in later Greek terminology, was the cornerstone of Mesopotamian religious practice. Once per year, during the New Year festival, the king of the city would ritually marry the high priestess of Inanna in a public ceremony witnessed by thousands. They would ascend the ziggurat together. They would enter the sacred chamber at the summit. They would consummate the marriage while drums pounded and crowds chanted prayers below. This act was believed to ensure the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the kingdom, the favor of heaven for the coming year. If the king failed to perform, through age, illness, impotence, or simple absence, disaster would follow: flood, drought, invasion, plague. But what happened once per year with the king happened nightly with merchants, travelers, and wealthy citizens. The theology was identical. The ritual structure was the same. The belief in cosmic necessity remained unchanged. The commercial transaction was merely scaled down, democratized, made accessible to anyone who could pay. 5 shekels bought you communion with the divine. 10 shekels bought you a higher-ranking priestess. 15 shekels bought you multiple nights, privacy, special ritual arrangements. Sacred prostitution was framed as the highest form of service. The harem too were not degraded, officially. They were elevated. They channeled divine power. They ensured the survival of civilization itself. They were honored in hymns, depicted in temple art, granted social status above common women. But the economic reality carved into administrative tablets tells a different story. The temple of Inanna in Uruk owned over 30,000 acres of farmland by 2300 BCE. It employed hundreds of workers, farmers who tended barley fields, herders who raised sheep for wool and sacrifice, weavers who produced textiles for trade, potters who shaped vessels for storing grain and oil, brewers who made beer for offerings and daily rations, scribes who recorded every transaction in cuneiform on clay tablets that were filed in archive rooms, with the same obsessive precision modern accountants would recognize and admire. The temple operated as a bank, lending grain and silver at interest rates specified in contracts. It collected taxes from surrounding villages. It controlled trade routes extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. And 30% of its annual revenue, perhaps more, the incomplete records make exact calculation impossible, came from the fees paid by men seeking the company of priestesses. The system was brilliant in its efficiency. By framing prostitution as religious duty, the temple avoided moral condemnation. By framing it as divine favor, it commanded premium prices. By framing it as cosmic necessity, it made refusal unthinkable. The women had no choice in who they served. Temple administrators assigned them based on availability, rank, and the customer's payment. A priestess could not refuse a ritual assignment without facing severe punishment. She could not express preference, disgust, fear, exhaustion. Her feelings were theologically irrelevant. She was a vessel for the goddess. Vessels don't have preferences. And the women could not leave. Once consecrated to the temple, a priestess could not marry. She could not return to her family. She could not pursue any other life. Sumerian law codes, including the famous Code of Ur-Nammu from 1200 BCE and the later Code of Hammurabi from 1050 BCE, specified harsh punishments for temple women who abandoned their duties. A harem too who fled the temple was hunted down by temple guards and returned in chains. If she refused to perform her sacred role upon return, she could be expelled from the temple with nothing, no property, no dowry, no family willing to take her back, because she had been consecrated and therefore belonged to the goddess, no means of survival, except the very prostitution she had tried to escape, but now without protection, status, or income guarantees. If she opened a tavern to support herself independently, competing with the temple's monopoly on beer production and sales, the law specified she would be burned alive. She had been made holy, and holiness in Sumer was a cage built of theology and economics, with walls as real as the mud bricks of the ziggurat. The temple controlled her body, her time, her future, her identity. In exchange, it provided food, shelter, safety from the brutal poverty that killed most women by age 30. It provided social status above peasants, though below free women who could marry and bear legitimate children. It provided a kind of respect, though respect for a sacred object is not the same as respect for a human being with desires, dreams, fears, agency. But beneath the official narrative of sacred duty and divine favor, there are hints of resistance, fragments, whispers, cracks in the monolithic facade of temple propaganda. The letter from Ur is not unique. Other fragments have been found, always incomplete, always damaged. as if something tried very hard to erase them. A graffito scratched into the wall of a temple chamber in Lagash. Inanna does not hear us. A clay tablet from Nippur that lists names of priestesses alongside the notation, fled. 17 names over a 30-year period. 17 women who ran. The records don't say what happened to them. The records rarely do. In 1967, archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer published a translation of a Sumerian poem titled The Message of Ludingira to His Mother. In it, a young man complains about the hardships of scribal school. But buried in the text is a single line that has puzzled scholars for decades. The temple women weep in the night, but the priests say, it is the sound of sacred ecstasy. Sacred ecstasy, or despair mistranslated by theology. The system endured for over 2,000 years. From the rise of Sumer around 4000 BCE to the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE, temple prostitution remained a fixture of Mesopotamian religion, as permanent and unquestioned as the sunrise, as necessary as the harvest, as inevitable as death. It was not confined to one goddess or one city. Inanna in Sumer became Ishtar in Babylon, Astarte in Canaan, Aphrodite Pandemos in Greece, Turan in Etruria. The practice spread with trade routes and conquest. Wherever Mesopotamian culture touched, temple prostitution followed. The Phoenicians brought it to the Mediterranean. Temples to Astarte in Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre operated on the same model. Priestesses available for a price, revenue flowing to the temple, theology justifying economics. The Canaanites practiced it throughout the Levant. The Greeks knew of it in the worship of Aphrodite at Corinth, where the temple employed over 1,000 sacred prostitutes at its height in the 5th century BCE. The Romans encountered it and were simultaneously fascinated and disgusted. Roman writers described the Babylonian temples with the same mixture of arousal and moral condemnation that characterizes most colonial literature about the sexual practices of conquered peoples. But empires fall, and with them their gods. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. Among them were priests who had lived in Mesopotamia for generations, who had witnessed the temple prostitutes in their blue-glazed chambers, who had seen the ziggurat rituals performed in the shadows of Babylon's walls, who had watched men line up with silver to purchase communion with the goddess. And they were horrified. When they wrote and compiled their sacred texts, the books that would become the Hebrew Bible, they condemned the practice with fury that still burns on the page 3,000 years later. The book of Deuteronomy declares, "There shall be no cult prostitute among the daughters of Israel, nor shall there be a cult prostitute among the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the fee of a prostitute or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God, in payment for any vow, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God." Abomination, the strongest condemnation in the Hebrew vocabulary. The prophet Hosea compares Israel's unfaithfulness to God as harlotry, using the imagery of temple prostitution as the ultimate betrayal. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution, and your daughters-in-law to adultery. The prophet Ezekiel describes Jerusalem as a woman who played the whore with foreign gods. You took your sons and daughters, whom you bore to me, and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children and delivered them up as offerings. The writers of the Hebrew Bible looked at the sacred prostitutes of Inanna and saw not holiness, but abomination. They saw the theological justification as demonic deception. They saw the priests who administered the system as servants of evil. They saw the women as victims or accomplices, depending on the writer's mood. And they were determined to ensure that Israel would never, ever adopt this practice. Christianity inherited this condemnation and amplified it into an obsession. When the Roman Empire converted in the 4th century CE, the ancient temples were closed by imperial decree. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE made Christianity the state religion. Within a generation, pagan temples throughout the empire were shuttered, vandalized, converted into churches. The priestesses were scattered. The rituals were forbidden under penalty of death. The statues of Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, and Aphrodite were toppled, smashed, buried. The practice that had been sacred for 3 millennia became, within a single generation, the ultimate sin. But the economic structure did not disappear. It simply moved outside the temples and into the streets. Prostitution continued, illegal, despised, but tolerated because men's desires did not vanish with the old gods. And the language changed. The women who had once been called beloved of the goddess and holy ones and consecrated servants were now called whores, harlots, daughters of sin, vessels of the devil. The social status vanished. The protection vanished. The income guarantees vanished. The theological justification that had elevated them above common women was stripped away, leaving only the transaction, only the body, only the shame. Re-hook, Brand 7, 17, done. And that's when historians stopped talking about it honestly. 17 den 19 Quorum. Chosum in chassis plus, son gesem. Modern historians remain bitterly divided over the reality of sacred prostitution. Some argue that Herodotus and the biblical writers exaggerated out of prejudice and cultural misunderstanding, that they projected their own moral anxieties onto foreign religious practices they found incomprehensible, that sacred prostitution was rare, symbolic, misinterpreted, or entirely mythological. These scholars point to the lack of explicit descriptions in Sumerian religious texts. The ambiguity of terminology, maybe harimtu, didn't mean prostitute at all, but simply devoted woman. The possibility that ritual sex was limited to annual ceremonies, involving only the highest-ranking priestesses and kings, not commercial transactions with common customers. They argue that ancient writers conflated different practices: processional ceremonies where women carried offerings, ritual marriages that were purely symbolic, economic transactions that had nothing to do with sex. They argue that archaeology reveals temple women who were property managers, not prostitutes. That modern scholars have imposed Victorian sexual anxieties onto ancient practices that were innocent, misunderstood, sanitized by time. But other scholars point to evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away. The clay tablets recording payments explicitly tied to named priestesses. Temple account books listing revenue from sacred offerings that fluctuates with the number of male visitors. Legal codes regulating the behavior of harimtu with specificity that makes no sense unless they were engaged in sexual commerce. The architectural remains of temple complexes with private chambers clearly designed for intimate encounters, not public worship. The sheer volume of administrative records that make sense only if temple prostitution was systematic, widespread, economically central to Mesopotamian religion, not occasional, not symbolic, not misunderstood, real, institutionalized, profitable. In 2008, a team of archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania, excavating the ruins of Uruk, uncovered a chamber sealed beneath the floor of the ziggurat's sacred marriage hall. The chamber had been deliberately filled with sand and rubble sometime around 2100 BCE. Why it was sealed is unclear. The team excavated carefully over 3 months. Inside were the remains of 23 women. The bones were arranged in careful rows, not piled haphazardly. Each body had been buried with jewelry: gold earrings, lapis lazuli necklaces, copper bracelets. With cosmetics in alabaster jars, kohl for eyes, rouge for lips, perfumes whose scents evaporated 4,000 years ago. With clay figurines of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, each figure identical, mass-produced in temple workshops. Carbon dating confirmed they died around 2300 BCE, during the height of Uruk's power as the largest city in the world. Bone analysis revealed they were aged between 15 and 30. No older, no younger. The demographic profile of the Harimtu in temple records. And the bones told their own story. The remains showed signs of chronic malnutrition, despite the luxury goods buried with them. Their diet was sufficient in calories, but poor in essential nutrients. They ate well by ancient standards, but not as well as the temple's propaganda claimed. Not as well as the priests who administered the system. Several skeletons had fractured ribs that had healed poorly, indicating violent trauma that received inadequate medical care. One skull showed evidence of a lethal blow, blunt force trauma to the left temple. Several pelvic bones displayed stress fractures, consistent with repeated sexual trauma at a young age, before the bones had fully matured. The official expedition report, published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 2011, listed the cause of death as unknown. But the chamber's location, directly beneath the sacred marriage hall, where the most important rituals were performed, suggested purpose. The women had served the goddess, and when they died, from violence, disease, exhaustion, or simply the brutal mathematics of ancient mortality, they were buried in her shadow, close enough to the goddess to be remembered, deep enough to be forgotten. Re-hook, Gra 8, 19. The tablets do not record whether Kubatum ever left the temple. 19, or 2030. Katartik Sonuch, plus, Miras, plus Dol CTA. Whether she lived to old age as a respected elder among the priestesses, honored for decades of service, teaching younger women the hymns and rituals. Whether she found some measure of peace in her role, some way to convince herself the theology was true, that she was blessed, that her suffering had cosmic meaning. Or whether she died young, whether her bones lie in some sealed chamber archaeologists haven't yet discovered. Whether her name appears on some tablet, not yet translated, listed among the women who fled, or the women who refused, or the women who simply stopped appearing in the records as if they had never existed at all. What survives is her name, Kubatum, beloved of the goddess, and 43 transactions, recorded in precise cuneiform on a clay tablet that spent 4,000 years buried in sand, listing the price of her divinity in silver shekels. The Sumerians built the first civilization. They gave humanity writing so that knowledge could outlive memory. They gave us law so that justice could be more than the whim of the powerful. They gave us mathematics so that we could measure the world and predict the movements of stars. They gave us epic poetry, Gilgamesh, Inanna's descent, the lament for so that we could understand what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to rage against mortality. They looked at the stars and mapped the heavens with accuracy that still astonishes modern astronomers. They drained the marshes and raised cities from mud. They turned barren land into gardens. They invented beer, the wheel, the plow, the sailboat, bureaucracy. And they built temples where women's bodies were the currency that purchased divine favor. History calls them prostitutes. Theology called them holy. The men who wrote the tablets, the priests, the scribes, the administrators, called them necessary. The merchants who paid called them entertainment. The kings who blessed the system called them essential to cosmic order. The women themselves left almost no words. The priests controlled literacy. The temples controlled the tablets. The men who recorded transactions had no interest in recording feelings. But sometimes, in the cracks, humanity leaks through. A shaky letter to a mother, graffiti on a temple wall, a poem that mentions weeping mistaken for ecstasy, 17 names listed as fled, 23 bodies buried beneath the place where heaven and earth supposedly met. In the ruins of Uruk, the ziggurat still stands, eroded by 4,000 years of wind and rain and war. The chamber where Kubatum once lay with strangers is buried beneath 15 feet of sand and rubble. The goddess Inanna, queen of heaven, receiver of hymns and sacrifices, and the bodies of her priestesses, is silent now. Her temples are dust, her rituals are forgotten, her priestesses are bones that archaeologists catalogue and museums display behind glass. But the questions remain. When religion and exploitation become the same thing, spoken in the same language, performed in the same holy places, blessed by the same prayers, what do we call it? Sacred duty, economic system, theological prostitution, divine will, civilization's necessary darkness, or simply, what powerful men have always done when they control the definition of holiness. The tablets do not answer. They only record the transactions, the names, the prices. 3 shekels, 5 shekels, 10 shekels. The cost of communion with the divine. The price of a woman who had no choice but to be holy. The mathematics of a system that endured for 2,000 years and still haunts us because we've never really stopped building temples where women's bodies are currency. We've just stopped calling them temples.